A very brief summary. Back in May of 2018, you'll recall, a landslide occurred during a rainstorm that brought down a significant portion of a bluff and blocked Shoal Creek, increasing the risk of flood. Since that time, the city has been working with private property owners, with city council, with stakeholders to move forward on a path to fix as many of the problems that were caused by that landslide. Again, just a refresher, some of the problems that were brought about by the landslide, in addition to the flooding caused by blocking Shoal Creek, were the loss of private property in the backyards that abutted Shoal Creek, the loss of service of a 30-inch wastewater line, the threat to electric utility, the loss of a hike and bike trail, as well as the use of that part of the park. So those were the things that we were faced with. Our approach has shifted from focusing on the very large slope stabilization as the focus of the problem solution down to Shoal Creek itself. Instead of looking at the significant engineering solution that would be based on stabilizing the slope, we're moving those efforts down to Shoal Creek itself to be opening up the available area for Shoal Creek to flow to reduce that flood threat. That's based on an analysis that we've done that shows, for the most part, the material that has failed and is down in the creek, the large mass of it is generally stable. However, as you get real close to the edge, there's still some instability, and so our ability to actually go in and dredge and clear that is limited. However, there is room in the adjacent park to be able to move the creek a little bit in order to open that up such that we reduce the current threat to flooding. I'm going to pause right there because that is the gist of this message, as we've moved from a slope stabilization project to a reducing a flood threat, and the nature of that project will change as a result of that.
With that pause, do you think the city has acted in good faith in trying to reach a compromise with homeowners?
Well, the city has absolutely acted in good faith, and the goal has not been a compromise, the goal has been a solution. We have acted per council direction to pursue the most comprehensive solution possible, which included stabilization along those private properties. We have been unable to reach an agreement with property owners on exactly what that looks like.
And what has been the biggest stumbling block in reaching that type of solution or agreement?
The ability to find a contractor to do this work is intimately tied in with negotiations with property owners. The city, as the agent on this, needs to employ a contractor, and in order to do work on private property, we must obtain easements or some other property rights in order to perform that work. The property owners have been, while in agreement to the conceptual solution that council gave approval to, began to request more detailed design information as the city started to negotiate for the easements that were needed. Putting these significant engineered structures into the slope in people's backyards was going to require some restrictions on what could be done in that backyard. Recall that we were going to be drilling large metal bars into the backyards in order to stabilize that. And so having that subsurface, it was a requirement for the stability of that certain things could and could not be done on the top, digging into the yards, things like that. It was with that realization that the property owners realized that this project had more depth to it, more dimensions than was originally anticipated. And so if the place where we were not able to get past was a resolution of which restrictions would be allowable for the city to install these engineered solutions in the backyard.
Do you feel like homeowners were more concerned with having maximum flexibility in how they use their backyard than with stabilizing the bluff?
Could you say that one more time, please?
Sure. Do you think homeowners were more concerned with how they might be able to use their own backyard, put in a pool, do anything they wanted to do, as opposed to stabilizing the bluff?
I think the homeowners were concerned with both of them. And because I am not one of the homeowners, it's really tough for me to put myself in the position of what I think they thought. So I'm going to stay away from that. But I know that they were concerned with both.
If it's a safety issue, is there anything the city, like was there another option the city could have pursued to kind of just go into that backyard and say, really this is the only option we have to stabilize the slope so it doesn't come down anymore? Like if it's a safety issue, I'm wondering, couldn't the city have had more flexibility in going in there to do the work?
I think I know where you're going, but I'm not quite sure.
Using safety as a reason, if you're citing safety, why couldn't the city have more power to actually pursue that stabilization option?
Ultimately, what the city is continue to focus on safety, and just as a reminder, our highest public health and safety issue right now is to the general public and people on public property is the flooding caused by Shoal Creek, with an estimated 2 feet increase in the water surface during a 100-year flood that would come into Lamar primarily and endanger folks in traffic. So that has been and continues to be the safety issue. So our focus now is, because we have had difficulty with a more comprehensive solution that encompasses both the safety of the public due to flooding as well as from wastewater lines and energy service, but also property protection on top, we are saying that public safety is the highest priority for the public agency, and therefore we're going to address the flood issue.
Without stabilizing the bluff, is the public safe on that greenbelt and using that trail?
As I mentioned before, our analysis shows that that massive material has a fairly high factor of safety. We don't anticipate the entire thing sliding like it did in May of 2019. May of 2019, we did have a second movement, and so this mass, which had moved like this, had paused, and then a year later it did this. Once it made that secondary move, it achieved a level of stability that should be stable. That caveat, however, is if we go in and begin to remove some of that, we might see what's called a shallow failure, which means it's small, it's not very tall, and it would be mostly impacting the safety of workers going into the creek and removing material.
Are you concerned about the portion of the bank that is still standing? Is that one stable, or can we expect to see more slides out of the more elevated position?
Help me understand which bank. If we're standing on in Shoal Creek looking to downtown, which side are you referring to?
So look toward the actual collapse. You said it
Okay.
went like this and then went down.
Yes.
There's still a huge wall backing up to all these properties.
Okay.
Is that stable?
Understood. And that's a good point, because this failure has got two physical pieces to it. We have a large vertical rock cliff, which everybody can see from Lamar standing down there, and I think that's what you're referring to. And then we have this much more clayey material that has a bunch of rock in it that underlays that. It's the clayey landslide failure that we believe is stable. Our ability to predict the stability of fractured rock is really limited. It's not it would be a very specialized element of engineering that we have not addressed. I don't know if there is the ability to determine that. We do know, however, that fractured rock that is exposed like that can fail. Is the possibility there? Yes. Can we calculate the probability? No.
It's safe to say, though, that you wanted to handle the slope stabilization first because you you want to not have to worry about that when then the city goes in and fixes the trail and does the debris cleanup in the creek. But now you're not able to do that, so that would, it makes it less ideal than it would have been had you been able to kind of secure that slope.
I agree.
Yeah.
Mike, can you talk a little bit more about the flooding risk? So if Shoal Creek was kept as is, you mentioned something about 2 feet flooding risk in Lamar. So if we didn't do anything to the creek and status quo is there, what happens to Lamar and just the areas around it if it rains really hard?
Correct. That's where let's go back to April of 2018 before the slide, and we have Shoal Creek generally contained within the Greenbelt area. The slide happens in May. That same storm would come and it would back up behind that, and it would be 2 feet higher in depth and therefore spill out over the curb into Lamar. That's the state where we're at right now. And so going in and creating a new channel for Shoal Creek within the parkland will bring that down.
Will it be like it was before the May 2019, or even better?
It will not be as much as before May 2018. It'll be better than right now. It will not be as good as it was. We're not able to achieve full solution without moving material. It's a balance because we're in the parkland, we have protected trees. Part of what's happening is Shoal Creek is maneuvering around the slide material and it's taking out the park on its own. We've got several protected heritage trees there, and as you know, we've got a sidewalk further out. We'd rather, in a planned manner, allow for the creek to have some conveyance, is what we call it. When we give water space to flow down the creek, we call it conveyance. We'd rather do that and rather than it move on its own and take down more nice oak trees or advance to the sidewalk. So it's really a compromise solution.
If you had been able to stabilize the cliff, would you have been able to return it back to the original flood, level, safety level that it had been previously?
Yes, we would, because we would have put in measures that allowed us to remove all of the material from the creek safely.
So then, after the May 2018, the original landslide, did flooding get worse on Lamar and other parts of Shoal Creek because of the landslide?
The threat did. We did not have a storm that actually caused that to happen. So the threat was there, it didn't manifest.
So we get another big rainfall, it's going to be worse than what we've seen it.
Can you say that one more time, please?
If we get another big rainfall, which we haven't had that magnitude since May 2018, it is going to be worse than what we saw it prior to May 2018.
Keeping the storm, I'm going to be a little engineering here,
Okay.
which I try only to do in my office. If we hold the storm constant and say the same storm would have happened before May 18 happens now, then the results will be worse, if that makes sense.
And the results weren't ideal before.
The results were okay from a public safety because flooding happens, but it was contained within a park. Now it's exceeded those boundaries, which is where it crossed the threshold for safety for us.
Mike, do you know how much the department, the city had spent trying to work on the stabilization solution? How much money did we already spend on this?
You know, I did not come with all of the figures. I can easily access that. We've gone to City Council to ratify those contracts that were done under emergency purchasing status. It approached $1 million. I can say that to give you exact. We can talk offline and I can send you the council resolutions with the ratifications and the exact contract amounts.
How would you, if a viewer were to say, well, then I feel like the city wasted all this time and money trying to focus on something that wasn't going to work out, how would you respond to that?
Trying to find a solution I don't think is ever a waste of time. What's key is knowing when you have to take some necessary off-ramps in order to get some solution done. We started out, again, in good faith, looking to solve as many problems as possible with the high price tag on it. at some point, when you've run to the end of a path on contractual and real estate negotiations, it becomes clear that the probability of getting that done is starting to shrink. And so continuing to put more money into that path we had less certainty that we're going to get to the ultimate solution. That's the off-ramp where you say, let's go back and take a look at this and make sure that we fully understand the current conditions as they are, reassess the risk, and then try to see if a Plan B solution makes more sense because we think we can get that done. So that's what we did.
Just to follow up on that question that you asked earlier, like, did the city consider like eminent domain or any of these kind of powers that governments can use to try to in the name of public safety and improving, like, getting the optimal solution for safety in public land?
Are you asking, did the city consider
did the
that?
city look at that
Certainly.
option?
It's part of the flow chart of any real estate transaction, is you have to consider if the public health and safety necessitates the acquisition of this property and we're unable to come to a voluntary agreement with a property owner, then the city has the ability to pursue that. So it was always in the planning or strategic discussions. But that in itself would not have led to a solution. It could have obviated a real estate element of it, but we still had the contractual element that stymied us with the contractor.
Could you explain that element a little bit more detailed? I'm trying to figure out why the contractors wouldn't work in these places.
Certainly. Good pivot on this one. We've been focusing on one of the two main elements, the real estate, but what really what caused us to make the change in policy was our inability to to get a contract signed with the contractor that council had authorized us with. Recall in June of 2019, council authorized staff to begin negotiations and execution of a contract with a contractor to come up with a design and a construction solution. We've been working with this firm, produced the conceptual plans that all the parties had agreed to. In July, as we began to combine the additional design efforts with the real estate negotiations, and it became clear to all parties that the property owners were going to require more detailed information before they allowed the city and its contractor to install this, the contractor began to recalculate their exposure and their risk from working so close to private properties. It was this recalculation on the part of the contractor that caused them to look at the insurance provisions that they carry as a company and determine that they were probably inadequately prepared to handle something should additional movement happen during construction. When the city contracts with someone, our minimum requirements and our language says because we're paying you and entrusting you to fix this and you're the agent on the property, then you need to assume the responsibility should something happen during construction. It's that full assumption of risk and what would happen if additional movement happened, additional damage happened to that property that caused the contractor to re-examine their insurance. At the end of the day, they weren't willing to assume all of the risk that the city requires so that the city does not end up taking on a potential monetary liability on the behalf of ratepayers that really should be in the realm of the contractor. We were unable to come to that agreement. I will add that that requirement in our contracts is for every single construction project that the city employs. This was not something new or special for this project. The contract language was available to the contractor at the very beginning of the negotiations. It just appears that they reevaluated their risks as we moved closer to signing the contract.
Could that problem play a role again under this new strategy when you're trying to work down below at the creek level?
No. The work being involved at the creek level, since it doesn't involve any real estate transactions or access to private property, it's just on public property, has a much lower risk profile. And so contractors that we've been in touch with do not have that same concern. The level of engineering and construction is an order of magnitude lower than what was contemplated working underneath houses.
Can you explain how shifting the current channel over into the parkland actually benefits the cliff, the slope right now, or will?
I don't know that moving the channel to address the flood issue affects positive or negatively the cliff at all. They're really two separate systems.
So will we ever see that trail be a continuous trail ever again?
That's now in the realm of Parks and Recreation taking the lead on that with the park stakeholders. We've got two conservancies who are really involved in the stewardship of all things Shoal Creek and Pease Park. We've got the Pease Park Conservancy and we have the Shoal Creek Conservancy. They represent a broad array of stakeholders, but you've also got neighborhoods, the neighbors involved there, and you've also got other people, hike and bike trail users. PARD realizes that for sure temporarily this diversion will continue, but then what to do long term in terms of now the risk assessment comes to the city. It says, well, is it possible to put something where it was? Is it a better idea to put it on the other side of the creek? If so, does it blend with the sidewalk over there? Those are pretty big questions, and now that we've reached this decision point, staff has got to go out to the particular stakeholders of the parks and the hike and bike trails and say, what do you think we should do?
Bottom line, tell me if I'm right or wrong. Bottom line seems to be that to preserve the backyards of handful of homeowners, we're looking at potentially greater flooding in a pretty popular city park. Fair or not fair?
I don't understand the nexus.
If they're not allowing you to stabilize the cliff to the degree that you had wanted to or thought would be ideal, and then therefore the potential flooding along the Greenbelt or creek could be higher or could not go back to previous levels, is the trade-off then not they get their backyards like they want, but the park is never quite where it was?
The park will not be quite where it was, correct. Over time, what's going to happen, we've seen this in 1952, a very similar landslide happened in the exact same area. You can go to the United States Geological Survey site and see the photos for yourself. Very similar landslide occurred. And back in those days, that was kind of getting close to the outskirts of town. We didn't have near the population, the focus on that. And so we have nothing in our records that indicates that occurred, which means there was only one house up at the top there. They may or may not have known about it, and nobody else seemed to know about that. What happened over time was that the creek eventually and gradually started to move that material. And it came back, and Shoal Creek opened up, and the trees grew back. Over time, we anticipate something similar happen. We call that working on geologic time, as opposed to when we want things done right now. We anticipate that'll happen. So we anticipate that gradually some of that material will move, and when you have gradual removal or shifting of earth, it can settle without a collapse. Even if a small chunk of that failed material collapses into Shoal Creek, that's not going to be the worst thing in the world, because we can either remove that then, and it'll have been done on its own, rather than sending workers in there kind of at peril to remove it. So if a little failure does happen on its own, it'll open it back up to pre-slide conveyance conditions. That's what we're anticipating and hoping will happen. So I think we can get to our desired flood condition with a little more time without necessarily having to do the slope.
And
It just
what's-
would have allowed us to do it quicker.
What's a little more time in geologic time frames?
It all depends on the amount of rain that we get.
So it could be a decade? Or are you talking less than that?
It could be months, it could be years.
Mike, are there other parts of Austin where we have some similar geography where there could be risks of landslide like this?
At some other point I can show you the map. I can show you the geologic map, and you'll see that these conditions do exist really up and down Shoal Creek, all the way, and it goes across the river too. So yes, the geologic conditions do exist. You can also go into the history. Some UT scientists and professors have got some neat histories on this. There have been these failures up and down that formation as going back to the 50s that we're aware of. So yes, it has happened. Yes, it could happen. We don't have any indication that there's an imminent threat any other place along that formation.
Can you remind us how many homes were affected by the original landslide and then the 2019 May one?
Yes,
Yeah.
four properties primarily whose backyards were impacted, and it was the same, that number did not really change.
Okay, okay. So then other homes, you know, on either side of those 4 homes, should those homeowners be concerned about this whole situation and whether their backyard might come collapsing down?
We don't have a firm handle on if this would spread up and down Shoal Creek. The best information that we've got includes that historical slide, which is contained to about the same area. Based on that, and based on some of the drainage improvements that we were able to make up top, we don't see this spreading upstream and downstream. It is, again, the same geologic formation exists without having that knowledge of, are there cracks in people's backyards in the bedrock? We're unable to say whether that's likely, imminent, or not likely.
So, just once again, what are you going to do to the creek now? Like, you're going to dig a channel to divert some of the water, or like, what's the plan now?
Yeah, the plan now is to send equipment, which would be in the form of probably a track excavator, if you know what that looks like. It's got like a bulldozer, but with an arm in there and a bucket, and we would dig out a portion of the existing Pease Park green belt and open it up so that there's a uniform cross-section. Cross-section is just that area. If I'm looking downstream at the creek like this is the cross-section. We want to make that uniform, and so that'll involve excavating material, moving some of the loose rock that has fallen that's not part of the big failure, and opening that up, putting that into dump trucks, and then hauling that off. A fairly standard civil process.
And then, the level you'll reduce, if there's some kind of like simple way of communicating the level you had hoped to reduce the flood risk with stabilization versus the level you'll be able to now without the ability to stabilize. And I know that's complicated. It's hard to describe.
I'm going to describe it in terms of 2-year flood kind of stuff. Y'all familiar? I think people are familiar enough about that since we've been talking so much about flooding with Atlas 14 and our increased risk. The ideal would be for that channel, for the flooding for the 100-year to be what it was prior to the landslide. This is going to allow us to get it to the 2-year flood to be what it was prior to the landslide.
So is that the risk is still about double what it was previously, or like the 1 year? So
what I don't have in front of me, which I think would help, is how much lower is the water going to be as a result of this, rather than us talking in 2 years
right,
and 25.
yeah.
I don't have that in front of me, and we're essentially will have that. What I was going to lead to is, and you may or may not ask this, but you can follow up. So we're in the process right now of designing that. Once we have that design, then we will be able to put that into a model and have exact calculations of how much lower the water will get. Right now, our estimate is that it is a 2-year storm. So I'll be able to confirm that in follow-ups. Right now, I just don't have it, but it'll be lower, less than 2 feet rise in the 100-year storm.
I think I got that.
Wow, I really would like some. It's going to be so much easier for our viewers if we can just say, maybe we can get that later. If you get a chance to look at that, like in terms of feet.
I don't, like I'm saying, I don't have that now because we're in design. So once I get that design and put it into the model, I'll be able to give you a nice graphic and show you here's where it was and here's where it's going to be and here's Lamar, and it'll be very clear, but I don't have that right now. This is the proposed solution and we've got to design it.
And just one last question about this real estate thing. It sounds as though, so, you know, the city considered using eminent domain or some more kind of extreme powers to try to access this land, but ultimately just decided that that option wasn't worth it for what you were intending to do. It kind of decided against that and decided
Yes.
that, yeah. I
Yes.
mean, like,
Agreed.
I guess that's where I was confused, because if you did do eminent domain, wouldn't you take a lot of the risk for the contractor away?
Eminent domain is just the acquisition of the property. And so that was, the acquisition of the property was necessary to do that. That's just a permission. It doesn't have anything to do really with the physical risk to the facilities. That just gives us permission to get on the property. It also contains the conditions under which the city and the contractor will leave the property, but the fact would remain that they're still drilling underneath houses.
I thought
So
it
it's
might
a-
reduce their risk of getting sued, or
Yeah, I mean,
I guess not.
It's if part of their concern was that they would be operating on private property, I guess the way we're thinking about eminent domain is that suddenly that would become kind of public right of way, so they wouldn't have that concern anymore. And maybe that's a question for the contractors, but you know, the way the whole thing is interrelated would make you think that it might help with the insurance concerns. But
No, it's really just an access and an ultimate responsibility. The city has permission to go onto private property, so it still remains private property with just an easement on there that the city would compensate the property owners at market value in order to install these systems. But any property owner can file a claim against an entity should something they perceive something happens to their property. So they're two separate but related issues.
When exactly will we see like the next steps actually occur?
In terms of people being out in Shoal Creek and removing things, what did we say? We're this spring. Yep, we expect to have a timeline and cost estimates this spring, so let's put that in a 3-month window.
To have a timeline for
Yeah,
everything.
correct.
how long do you think, and maybe you don't know now, but how long do you think it would take to kind of get this wrapped up now?
Once we, these kind of projects, once we begin them, typically take 6 to 9 months.
Do you imagine that any solution for the trail would only come after the work on the creek is completed? And maybe that's a question for Parks, but like it seems like you were trying, you know, cliff, then creek, then trail. Like there was an order of things before that we talked about.
It was fair to say that before we did any alternate planning, we wanted to make sure that we were going forward, because the plan was to put the trail back where it had been before. So we had this silent plan B on the side we hope we didn't have to access. Now we're firmly having to consider a plan B. That planning now can begin more in reality, so Parks can start opening up the conversations as to what do we want this to look like.
Thanks.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Just to clarify, so about 3 months to get the plans, then 6 to 9 months to do the project.
That's correct.
This time next year,
Yes.
Will Dupree here in the KXAN Live studio. You just heard from Mike Kelly. He's the City of Austin's managing engineer. He's discussing the options that the city is now pursuing to address that landslide that happened along Shoal Creek in May 2018. That happened almost 2 years ago, and they're still working on solutions to this, and he outlined some of the issues that they've been facing. He says that the city is now going to pursue removing some of the debris that came cascading down that hill. And as our live stream comes down, I'm going to show some video of that particular area. What the city is going to do is remove some of the debris that you see right there that came down into the creek. They're also going to have to move the creek in certain areas so that the flood risk is lowered in that area. Right now, all that debris is obstructing the flow of the water in the creek, so they're going to be focusing on that in particular. Now, take a look at this video. That bluff that came down in 2018 because of that rainstorm on May 4th, 2018, they are not going to be working to stabilize that bluff, and that is because there are two different issues here. The city had a contractor that was going to be looking into designing a solution to stabilize that slope. That would have included drilling metal poles down into the earth to hold it in place. And that would mean that the city would have to go onto private property, those homes that are sitting on the top of that bluff there, to do that work. Okay, so the city was working with a contractor on that, and that came with certain risks that the contractor had issues with too. Then the other piece is working with those private property owners at the top of the bluff there to be able to do that work, and that's where another obstacle was raised. So some of those property owners were saying they had issues with the city coming onto their property and that they might have restrictions to what work they could even do on their property because of those metal poles and the engineering and design of holding that bluff in place. So without any kind of deal being able to be reached with the contractor and those homeowners at the top of the hill, the city says they are not going to be addressing that particular portion of it. Instead, they are going to be focusing now on reducing the flood risk there along Shoal Creek. So they'll be working on that. They're also going to be eventually working on getting the trail back intact in that area, but that will come a little bit later, and also addressing the destruction of a wastewater pipeline that was destroyed in this landslide. So again, those two things will come at a later time, the trail and the wastewater issues, but for now the city is going to work on removing some debris and even changing the path of the Shoal Creek right there so that the flood risk is lowered. The city said that it would likely begin those steps in the coming months, and then it would take about 6 to 9 months to be able to do that work. So, of course, the timeline for this is going to be extended even more.